The Mysterious Christmas Visitor. A Miss Marple Mystery. Welcome to Mystery Crackers. I'm Michael, your host for tonight's Miss Marple Mystery. It's always a pleasure to have you here. Before we begin, I'd love to know what's something you've always been curious about. A small habit people have, a place you've never been, or even a mystery that's stayed with you for years. Share it with us in the comments. I truly enjoy reading your thoughts. Now then, settle in, and let's begin tonight's story. Chapter 1. The air in the village of Little Cranford was crisp, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke from the hearths of the cottages. It was the day before Christmas, and as twilight approached, the villagers gathered at the home of Mrs. Edith Melrose, an elderly widow known for her grand but humble tea parties. Her house, a modest Victorian with ivy creeping up the walls, was a warm refuge from the biting cold outside. The candles flickered as the small room filled with the soft murmur of voices, a collection of local personalities, all of them seemingly ordinary and unremarkable. Among the guests were Miss Marple, of course, who had lived in Little Cranford for as long as anyone could remember. Her quiet presence was always a constant at Mrs. Melrose's gatherings. She sat in her usual spot by the fire, a cup of tea cradled in her hands, her eyes hidden behind the wire-framed spectacles that perched delicately on the bridge of her nose. Her hearing, sharp as ever, absorbed every word, every nuance in the room, but she said little. It was the way Miss Marple preferred it. Observation over participation, letting others reveal what they wished to reveal. The group consisted of a range of village residents, young couples, older friends, and a few newcomers. There was the pleasant but somewhat brash Mrs. Laverne, a local shopkeeper whose opinions on nearly everything were as unyielding as her leather-bound ledgers. Dr. Davies, the mild-mannered local physician with a peculiar habit of avoiding eye contact when discussing anything personal, and the enigmatic Mr. Clarendon, a man whose wealth was a subject of village gossip, though no one quite knew how he made his money. As tea was served, and the conversation meandered from the weather to the upcoming Christmas festivities, Miss Marple's attention was drawn to a newcomer, a young woman named Sylvia Morrow. She had recently arrived in the village, settling into a small cottage by the edge of the wood. Her pale face and tightly held composure struck Miss Marple, who knew better than most that outward appearances could mask a great deal. Sylvia was politely charming, but there was something in her posture, the way she kept her hands clasped tightly in her lap, that suggested she was not entirely at ease. It was then that the first hint of unease swept through the room, subtle but unmistakable. Mrs. Laverne's loud voice cut through the general chatter, announcing her new acquisition from a recent shopping trip, as if to assert her dominance over the group with the acquisition of material goods. The others nodded politely, some with forced smiles, others more interested in the warmth of their cups. But the tension was palpable. Hidden behind the casualness of village life, there were unspoken words, strained relationships, and secrets tucked into the folds of everyday existence. Miss Marple watched, her thoughts drifting as she carefully observed the others. The way Mr. Clarendon kept shifting in his seat, as though his clothes were too tight, the quick glance he threw towards Sylvia as she refilled her teacup, it was enough to make her wonder. He seemed uneasy in her presence, though for what reason Miss Marple could not yet say. It was a curiosity that Miss Marple would file away for future reference. But the evening continued, and no one suspected that this gathering would soon be overshadowed by tragedy. As the guests left Mrs. Melrose's home one by one, The village remained peaceful under the starry sky, unaware that something dark and sinister was about to unfold in their midst. Little did they know that Sylvia Morrow, with her guarded demeanour, was about to become the focus of an investigation that would shake the very foundation of their small community. Chapter 2. The day after Mrs. Melrose's Christmas gathering dawned cold and grey. Snowflakes clung to the bare branches of trees, dusting the ground with a fine, glittering layer of white. In Little Cranford, life moved at its usual leisurely pace. The village square remained tranquil, the familiar hum of the local baker's oven mingling with the occasional clip-clop of a horse-drawn cart. Yet, despite the outward calm, a shift had occurred, barely noticeable to most, but not to Miss Marple. She had spent the morning taking a quiet walk through the village lanes, as was her habit, watching the frost sparkle on rooftops and listening to the murmurs of village life. Her keen observations hadn't turned up much new information, aside from the usual small talk and the occasional gossip that was the lifeblood of rural communities. But something nagged at her. It was during her afternoon visit to Mrs. Melrose's that Miss Marple first noticed the ripple of unease among the villagers. It wasn't a loud, dramatic change. Rather, it was subtle, an undercurrent in the way people spoke to one another. When Miss Marple arrived at Mrs. Melrose's, she was greeted by a nervous silence that seemed to stretch across the room. The usual welcoming warmth of the widow's tea gatherings had been replaced with a stiffness that Miss Marple didn't fail to notice. Mrs. Melrose, the ever-gracious hostess, was the first to speak, though her voice lacked its usual light-hearted cheer. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," she said, her smile tight. "We've just had the most dreadful news." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. Dreadful news? Mrs. Melrose, despite her best efforts to appear composed, fluttered her hands as she motioned toward the other guests who were huddled in an awkward silence. "I'm afraid it's Sylvia Morrow. She's missing. Missing!" Miss Marple's voice was low, careful. She allowed the silence to settle, giving Mrs. Melrose a chance to explain, though she knew the answer would not come easily. The other guests who had gathered around in an uneasy cluster seemed to hold their breath as they waited for Mrs. Melrose to continue. After a long pause, she did. The poor girl. She arrived here just a week ago, and now, just as suddenly, she's vanished. No one saw her leave. No word, no explanation. Miss Marple's eyes flicked to the others in the room. Mrs. Laverne, who had been listening with an air of scepticism, was the first to speak up. "It's all very strange. We've seen her around the village, but she hasn't made much of a mark. Very private, you know. Not a soul knows anything about her background. She could have run off, for all we know." Dr. Davies, seated in the corner with a book in hand, removed his spectacles and gave a thoughtful glance. "It's not like Sylvia to just disappear. She didn't strike me as the sort who would do such a thing without a reason." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, observing the way the room's mood shifted. Suspicion, though unspoken, was in the air. Mrs. Melrose had gone pale, her hands trembling ever so slightly as she poured herself a fresh cup of tea. She glanced at Miss Marple with an expression that conveyed more than words could say. It was as if she knew the village wasn't quite as peaceful as it seemed, and that something deeper was at play. "I do hope nothing terrible has happened to her," Mrs. Melrose said quietly, her eyes narrowing as though she were weighing a thought too heavy to speak. "Is anyone looking for her?" Miss Marple asked, her voice calm, but her mind already starting to form connections. She had never believed in coincidences. Mrs. Melrose nodded, The constable is organising a search party, but," she hesitated, looking toward Mrs. Laverne, "there's been talk that Sylvia was seen in the company of Mr. Clarendon the night before her disappearance. There were whispers, you know. No one likes to speak openly about it, but, well, it's worth noting, isn't it?" The room fell quiet, all eyes on Miss Marple. She allowed the moment to linger, her mind sifting through the possibilities. Mr. Clarendon, the man who had been so strange at the party, so unsettled in his manner towards Sylvia. His unease had not been lost on her, and now it seemed there was more to it than just an offhand glance. "I'll certainly look into it," Miss Marple said finally, her voice calm, but her thoughts were already racing. There were too many strange coincidences here, too much discomfort swirling beneath the surface. Sylvia Morrow's disappearance, Mr. Clarendon's odd behaviour, and the barely contained suspicion among the villagers. It was the beginning of something, Miss Marple knew, but she wasn't yet sure what. The rest of the afternoon was spent in hushed conversations, but Miss Marple had heard enough. She could feel the web of tension tightening, each person clutching their secrets closer. The village was unravelling at the edges, and Sylvia Morrow's disappearance was only the beginning. As Miss Marple left Mrs. Melrose's house, the cold air seemed sharper than before. She had her suspicions, but she would need more pieces to the puzzle before she could make any conclusions. There was something more at play here, and she would take her time uncovering it, piece by piece. Chapter 3. The morning after Sylvia Morrow's disappearance dawned with a faint mist curling through the streets of Little Cranford. Miss Marple had risen early, as was her custom, and walked the familiar paths to the village square. The peacefulness of the village, so often its hallmark, now felt distant, as though the very air had shifted since the previous evening. Her first stop was to the constable's office. Constable Hayes, a burly man with a quiet demeanour, was hard at work, his uniform neatly pressed despite the storm of rumours swirling around the disappearance. He greeted Miss Marple with a faint but respectful nod. "I'm glad you came, Miss Marple," he said, his voice low but with an edge of weariness. "We're doing what we can, but the village isn't quite what it used to be. There's talk of things that shouldn't be spoken aloud." "Perhaps I can help," Miss Marple said gently, folding her hands in front of her. She didn't ask directly for any information. Instead, she allowed her quiet presence to draw him into a conversation. "I've spoken to most of the villagers," Hayes continued, pulling a map of the village toward him. "We've scoured the woods, the surrounding cottages, even the river, but there's nothing, no sign of her. Not a trace." Miss Marple glanced at the map, noting the markings of the search areas. "Tell me, Constable, who was the last person to see Sylvia?" Hayes paused, his eyes flickering with uncertainty. "Well, some say she was last seen at Mrs. Melrose's tea party, but others say she spent some time with Mr. Clarendon the night before she disappeared." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened, though she said nothing in response. She had already formed a small theory, though it was still incomplete. She waited, letting him continue. "There's something odd about Mr. Clarendon," Hayes muttered, almost as if he were talking to himself. "He's been here for years, but no one really knows anything about him. A bit of a recluse, you know. Always about his business, but never any close friends. Too quiet, if you ask me." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her mind working through the possibilities. She could see the constable's struggle. There was an obvious suspicion hanging in the air, but no clear evidence. People's natural tendency to look for a simple explanation was at play. But in Miss Marple's experience, things were rarely as straightforward as they seemed. "Have you spoken with Mr. Clarendon?" she asked, her tone soft but probing. "I've tried, but he's out of town. A business trip, or so he claims. He left just after Sylvia disappeared. I'd say it's a bit suspicious, but—" He trailed off, clearly uncertain. "Quite," Miss Marple agreed, her eyes distant for a moment. She could see how easily the villagers could be swept into wild theories and suspicions. But there was something about Clarendon's sudden departure that struck her as too convenient, too rehearsed. "I'll take a walk through the village and speak with a few of the locals," Miss Marple said, her voice light, though her eyes were sharp. "Perhaps there is something else we've overlooked." As she left the constable's office, Miss Marple's footsteps led her past familiar cottages, her thoughts turning over the fragments of information she had gathered. The most obvious lead was Mr. Clarendon, but Miss Marple was careful not to fall into the trap of easy conclusions. She had learned long ago that the simplest answers were often the most dangerous to trust. Her next stop was Mrs. Laverne's shop. The local grocer, whose sharp tongue was known to be as cutting as her gossip, was busy arranging jars on the shelf when Miss Marple entered. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Laverne greeted her with a raised eyebrow. "What brings you here today?" "I'm merely doing a bit of checking," Miss Marple replied, her voice casual. "I've heard some interesting talk about Sylvia Morrow. You knew her, didn't you?" "Of course I did," Mrs. Laverne answered briskly. "She came by to buy a few things, I remember, because she seemed to be in a bit of a hurry. Poor thing, she was always so nervous. I never could make her feel at home. Not like other girls around here." "Nervous?" Miss Marple echoed, her interest piqued. "What do you mean by that?" Mrs. Laverne set the jar down with a sharp clink, her eyes flicking to the side as if she were weighing her words. "Well, it's hard to say. She didn't seem to trust anyone, if you ask me. Always looking over her shoulder. Never stayed long. But there's something more. There were times when she'd talk about Mr. Clarendon. She didn't like him much, I could tell." Miss Marple leaned slightly forward, her gaze steady. "Did she say why?" Mrs. Laverne shrugged, though the nervousness in her movements was not lost on Miss Marple. "I don't know, but she was always careful not to say much. A bit mysterious, that one." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. It was the first crack in Sylvia's carefully constructed shield that she had found. It wasn't much, but it was something. An inkling of unease in Sylvia's past with Clarendon, perhaps. But was it enough to connect him to her disappearance? Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Laverne and left the shop, her mind turning once again. The puzzle pieces were slowly starting to form, but there was still too much ambiguity. She needed more from the villagers, and more from the shadows that had yet to be cast in the light of suspicion. Chapter 4. The days that followed the Sylvia Morrow's disappearance were filled with the usual mix of gossip, half-hearted searches, and murmurs of suspicion. The villagers were unsettled, but nothing definitive emerged. Miss Marple continued her quiet observations, letting the currents of gossip swirl around her, knowing that sometimes the loudest voices were the least trustworthy. On the third day after Sylvia's disappearance, Miss Marple paid another visit to Mrs. Melrose's house. It was growing colder, and the thick layers of snow outside had begun to look more like a prison than a winter wonderland. The sense of isolation in the village was palpable, but in the heart of the community, behind the warmth of Mrs. Melrose's parlour, there was still a sense of denial. People didn't want to believe that something darker was lurking in their peaceful village. Miss Marple arrived just as Mrs. Laverne was finishing a conversation with the local constable, who was once again searching for any signs of Sylvia's whereabouts. The grocer was sitting in her usual spot, a cup of tea in front of her, her posture rigid as she glanced around the room, clearly disturbed by the growing tension. Miss Marple, noticing her discomfort, settled herself into the chair next to her. "Any progress?" Miss Marple asked, her voice soft but insistent. Mrs. Laverne sighed, a deep, almost frustrated sound. "No progress at all. I've heard a few rumours about Mr. Clarendon, naturally. They say he was seen leaving the village the day before Sylvia went missing. He's gone off to London, but no one can confirm that for sure." Miss Marple leaned forward, her gaze steady. "And what do you think? Does it seem likely to you that he had something to do with Sylvia's disappearance?" Mrs. Laverne's eyes flickered. Then she lowered her voice. "Well, I don't trust him. But I don't know if he's guilty. It's too easy, don't you think? Everyone's jumping on him because he's a bit of a mystery. I've lived here long enough to know that you don't get the truth by looking for the most obvious culprit." Miss Marple nodded slowly. It was a sensible thought. Sometimes the most obvious suspect was the one who could afford to be the most clever in deceiving everyone. She'd learned that through years of observation. People were rarely as straightforward as they appeared. "Have you spoken to him directly?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Laverne shook her head. "Not since the day he left, but I will tell you this, there's something off about him. He's always a little too smooth, a little too polished. Like he knows things others don't, or he's hiding something." Before Miss Marple could respond, the door creaked open, and in walked Dr. Davies, looking as though he'd been deep in thought. The sight of him made Miss Marple's sharp eyes narrow slightly. He seemed different today, his usual composed demeanour now tinged with an uncharacteristic nervousness. He cleared his throat and smiled faintly at Mrs. Laverne and Miss Marple. "Ah, Miss Marple, just the person I was hoping to see," he said, his voice a bit too strained. "I wanted to update you on Sylvia. I've been checking with the other doctors in the region, and no one's seen her for a week, but I did learn something rather interesting. There was a report of a woman, matching her description, seen passing through the town a few days ago. She was with a man, someone unfamiliar." "Could it have been Mr. Clarendon?" Miss Marple asked, her voice calm, though her mind was already piecing together the new information. Dr. Davies hesitated before answering. "I didn't get a name, but it seems possible. The woman was described as being on edge, and the man with her seemed in a hurry. I can't say for certain, though." Miss Marple sat back, considering the implications. The fact that Sylvia had been seen leaving town, perhaps in a hurry, perhaps under duress, was new information, but it didn't necessarily point to Mr. Clarendon. And yet there was a nagging feeling in the back of her mind. Could there be a connection? Or was someone trying to mislead everyone? Mrs. Laverne, sensing the shift in Miss Marple's focus, added, "Well, there's always something about that man that doesn't sit right with me. But I wouldn't jump to conclusions. There's a lot of talk, but we're all grasping at straws." Miss Marple nodded again thoughtfully. "It's important not to jump to conclusions, Mrs. Laverne, but it's also important to keep our minds open to all possibilities, no matter how unlikely they may seem." As the conversation continued, Miss Marple listened intently, observing the subtle ways the others reacted to the new information. Each person's reaction was a clue in itself. Dr. Davies, though a trusted member of the village, was avoiding eye contact when discussing the stranger seen with Sylvia. His discomfort wasn't lost on Miss Marple. Was it guilt? Was it knowledge of something more? As the day wore on, Miss Marple took her leave. She had gathered more information, though none of it was definitive. But one thing was becoming clear. There were too many people in the village who were keeping their cards close to their chest. No one, it seemed, was entirely innocent. And now, she was beginning to suspect that the real answer was more complicated than a simple case of a missing woman and a suspicious man. There were deeper layers to uncover, and Miss Marple knew just how to begin peeling them back. Chapter 5. The search for Sylvia Morrow continued to drag on with no new leads. The constable had sent out teams, scouring the outskirts of the village, the woods, and the nearby fields. Miss Marple, however, took a different approach. She didn't seek the obvious. She watched, observed, and listened. The villagers' chatter and their reactions told her more than any formal investigation could. After another quiet morning spent walking the village lanes, Miss Marple made her way to the old churchyard. The place had a sombre feel about it. The gravestones worn with age, the moss creeping over the edges. It was a spot where the villagers often came to reflect, perhaps to seek solace from life's troubles. But today, Miss Marple had another reason for her visit. She had learned that Sylvia Morrow had often spent time here, walking alone, contemplating in the shade of the ancient yew tree. It seemed an odd place for someone so young, so new to the village, to find peace. And yet, it had become a familiar spot for her. As Miss Marple entered the churchyard, she scanned the area, noting the small details that others might overlook. The faint impressions in the snow, where footsteps had been leading toward the old crypt. She bent down, inspecting the ground closely. Her sharp eyes caught a faint outline in the snow, something that didn't quite belong. A piece of fabric, almost hidden beneath a layer of frost. Miss Marple reached down, brushing away the snow. It was a torn scrap of cloth, dark and threadbare. She held it carefully in her gloved hand, examining it closely. The fabric was soft, almost worn to the point of fraying. It was the kind of cloth that belonged to someone who had been living on the edge. Someone who had spent time in places far less comfortable than this peaceful village. The kind of fabric that belonged to someone used to hiding their true self. The mystery of Sylvia's disappearance deepened. Miss Marple had known there was something unusual about the girl, something in the way she kept herself apart from the rest of the village. But this small clue, this scrap of fabric, felt like an unspoken message. It was too deliberate to be an accident. Miss Marple carefully placed the cloth into an envelope she had brought along, her mind already moving toward the next step. She needed more information, something that would link this clue to the larger picture. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple returned to Mrs. Melrose's house, where the constant chatter of the villagers had grown louder in her absence. The air was thick with whispered speculations. Sylvia's disappearance had become the sole topic of conversation, and there was a palpable sense of unease in the room. As Miss Marple entered, Mrs. Melrose, who was seated at the window, gave her a questioning glance. "I hope you've found something, Miss Marple. It's so hard to sit here, listening to all this talk. It's as if everyone's waiting for something to happen." "I've found something," Miss Marple replied, quietly, her tone measured. "But it's not enough yet to make any conclusions." "Do you think Mr. Clarendon is involved?" Mrs. Melrose asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I just can't understand what he would have to do with it, but it feels wrong. So much talk about him, and then Sylvia vanishes." Miss Marple remained calm, her gaze focused as she considered her response. "The most obvious answers are often the most misleading, Mrs. Melrose. The truth, as always, is often much more complicated." Before Mrs. Melrose could respond, the door opened, and Dr. Davies stepped into the room. He had a distracted air about him, as though he had been thinking of something else entirely. When he saw Miss Marple, his expression shifted slightly, as though caught off guard. "I wanted to speak with you, Miss Marple," he said, his voice more strained than usual. "There's something you should know." "Go on," Miss Marple prompted, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied his face. She had sensed a change in him, a shift that wasn't lost on her. Dr. Davies glanced nervously around the room before stepping closer. "I've been thinking. I've looked into a few things, some of the records, the village gossip, things that didn't quite add up before. There's something about Sylvia's family, her past, that doesn't sit right. I'm not sure what it means, but it could be important." Miss Marple's interest piqued. "What have you found?" "I was able to find some information about her father," Dr. Davies said quietly, lowering his voice as if afraid someone might overhear. "He wasn't just some poor man. He was involved in some unsavoury dealings, though no one talks about it. It's as though the village has swept it under the rug. Sylvia came here to escape it, but that's the thing. There are rumours that she wasn't just hiding from him. She was running from someone else, someone much more dangerous." Miss Marple listened intently, her mind whirring. This new information added another layer of complexity to the mystery. Sylvia's background, her true reason for fleeing her past, was something that Miss Marple had suspected was central to the case. But this was the first concrete piece of the puzzle she had been able to place. "Who else knew about this?" Miss Marple asked, her tone even, though her heart was beginning to race with the possibilities. Dr. Davies hesitated. "I think Mrs. Laverne might know. She was quite familiar with Sylvia, and there's been talk about them having disagreements. But as for anything concrete, well, that's all I have for now." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her thoughts racing. The more she learned, the more the mystery seemed to shift. Sylvia's disappearance was no longer just a matter of a missing girl. It was a tangled web of secrets, lies, and hidden histories. And Miss Marple was determined to uncover them all. "Thank you, Dr. Davies," Miss Marple said, her voice soft. "You've given me much to consider." As the conversation wrapped up, Miss Marple left Mrs. Melrose's house once more, the small scrap of fabric still tucked in her pocket. It was clear to her now that every answer she sought would require careful patience, and just the right moment to connect the dots. But one thing was certain. The true nature of Sylvia's disappearance was far darker than anyone had imagined. Chapter 6. The chill in the air grew more biting as Little Cranford's search for Sylvia Morrow entered its second week. The village had begun to settle into a rhythm of unease. The search parties had scoured the nearby fields, the woods, and even the riverbank, but Sylvia remained elusive. Miss Marple, however, was not one to chase after empty leads. She understood that the real answers lay in the subtle details, details that could only be unearthed by those who observed, not just searched. After her conversation with Dr. Davies, Miss Marple knew she had to investigate further into Sylvia's past, particularly the mystery surrounding her father's shadow. The village, so often content to whisper about newcomers, had already begun to gossip about the Morrow family. It seemed that Sylvia's return to the village, though brief, had stirred up old secrets, secrets that had remained buried for years. Miss Marple decided to begin with Mrs. Laverne. She had been the one to mention Sylvia's unease, her discomfort with Mr. Clarendon, and her nervous demeanour. Mrs. Laverne was a fixture in the village, a source of information, whether she intended to be or not. The grocer's shop was quiet when Miss Marple arrived. Mrs. Laverne was behind the counter, arranging jars of preserves with methodical care. The faint smell of herbs and spices mixed with the hum of the afternoon light. When Mrs. Laverne saw Miss Marple enter, she didn't immediately greet her. Instead, she paused, wiping her hands on her apron, as if steeling herself for a conversation she knew was coming. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Laverne," Miss Marple said, her voice light but steady. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "No more than usual," Mrs. Laverne replied with a strained smile, her eyes darting toward the shelves before settling back on Miss Marple. "What can I do for you today, Miss Marple?" "I was hoping to speak with you about Sylvia," Miss Marple said, her gaze never leaving the grocer's face. "You knew her better than most in the village, I imagine." Mrs. Laverne's expression tightened, but she nodded slowly. "Yes, I did. She came by often, though always in a hurry. There was something about her, something that didn't sit right. But I never imagined she would just disappear, not like this." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "What do you mean? You think she was hiding something?" "Not hiding exactly," Mrs. Laverne muttered, her fingers drumming nervously on the counter. "But there was something about her family. She never spoke much about her father, but there were whispers. People said he was involved in some bad business, something with money, but I never knew the full details." Miss Marple's heart quickened. This was the first hint she had gotten that tied Sylvia's past directly to something darker. She leaned in a little closer, keeping her tone casual. "Whispers? Do you think Sylvia was involved in any of it?" Mrs. Laverne shifted uncomfortably, her eyes flicking toward the door, as if expecting someone to overhear. "I don't know, Miss Marple. I don't like to spread rumors. But there's something strange about how she came to the village, how she settled in so quickly and yet stayed so distant. It's like she was running from something or someone. Maybe Mr. Clarendon, maybe someone else." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing with the possibilities. There was a pattern here, but it was still too fragmented to see the full picture. Mrs. Laverne's suspicions about Mr. Clarendon were becoming more pronounced, but Miss Marple needed something more concrete. "Do you know anyone else who might have seen Sylvia recently? Perhaps someone who knew her father better?" Miss Marple asked, her voice steady. Mrs. Laverne hesitated before replying. "There's old Mr. Timmins, the retired farmer. He's been in the village longer than anyone, and he remembers everything. If anyone knows the history of the Morrow family, it's him." "Thank you, Mrs. Laverne," Miss Marple said with a nod, her thoughts already turning to the next step. Old Mr. Timmins could prove to be the key to unlocking the mystery of Sylvia's past. Miss Marple made her way to Mr. Timmins's cottage, which sat on the outskirts of the village. The house was small but well kept, with a neat garden that had long since stopped blooming. When she knocked on the door, it creaked open, and an elderly man peered out, his face lined with years of sun and wind. His eyes were sharp, though, and Miss Marple could see immediately that he was no fool. "Miss Marple, isn't it?" he asked, his voice gruff but polite. "What can I do for you?" "I was hoping to speak with you about Sylvia Morrow," Miss Marple said, her gaze steady as she sized him up. "I understand you knew her family." Mr. Timmins's face shifted slightly at the mention of Sylvia's name, a flicker of recognition passing through his eyes. He stepped back, allowing Miss Marple to enter. The inside of the cottage was dim but cozy, filled with the scent of wood smoke and the faint smell of tobacco. "I knew her father," Mr. Timmins said as they sat by the hearth. "A hard man, not someone you'd want to cross. He was always involved in something shady, though no one ever had proof of anything, at least no one who was still alive." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Shady?" Mr. Timmins nodded slowly. He had his hands in a lot of things. People whispered about him being part of some gang, involved in things that could ruin a man if they got out. But Sylvia, she was different. She tried to leave that life behind, or so I thought. Do you think Sylvia's disappearance has something to do with her father's past? Miss Marple asked, her tone even, though her mind was already drawing connections. I don't know, Mr. Timmins said, his voice quieter now. But I'll tell you this, there's something off about all this. She wasn't just hiding from him. I think she was hiding from something much worse. And that man, Mr. Clarendon, I've seen him around too. Too much for my liking. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts starting to fall into place. It was a long shot, but she was beginning to see that the mystery of Sylvia's disappearance was tangled not just in her own family's secrets, but in someone else's as well. Chapter 7. The sun had dipped low behind the hills, casting a golden glow over the village of Little Cranford. The snow that had once blanketed the village now lay in patches, evidence of the heavy foot traffic from the search parties. Despite the bustle, the village itself felt oddly still, as if it were holding its breath. Miss Marple's mind churned with the new information she had gathered. Sylvia Morrow's father, the mysterious figure of Mr. Timmins's account, seemed to hold the key to many unanswered questions. Yet there was something she couldn't place, a nagging feeling that kept her from drawing the full picture. She had learned that Sylvia was trying to escape something far darker than the usual village dramas, but the exact nature of the threat remained elusive. She had planned to visit Mr. Clarendon next, but the news of another event in the village diverted her path. As Miss Marple strolled down the street, a young boy came running toward her, his face flushed with urgency. "Miss Marple, you need to come to the mill," he called, breathless. "Something's happened." Miss Marple's heart quickened. Another twist, another turn in this tangled web. She followed the boy through the village, her footsteps steady but quick. As they approached the mill, she could see a small crowd gathered around the entrance. Voices, though hushed, buzzed in the air, and there was a sense of anticipation as the onlookers waited for something. "What's going on?" Miss Marple asked one of the villagers standing at the edge of the group. "The miller's wife. She's gone missing too," the woman replied, her voice trembling with fear. "Just like Sylvia, but this time it's different. It's like she vanished into thin air." Miss Marple's brow furrowed as she stepped past the crowd and into the mill. Inside, the heavy scent of damp wood mixed with the sharp tang of flour dust. The miller, a tall man with broad shoulders and a stony expression, stood near the machinery, his hands resting on the railing. His wife, a woman known for her quiet, reserved nature, was nowhere to be seen. "I don't know what to make of it, Miss Marple," the miller said, his voice rough. "She was here this morning, as always. We had our breakfast, and then I went to check the mill. When I came back, she was gone, not a trace. It's as if she just walked out and vanished." Miss Marple glanced around the mill, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. She noticed that the floor around the millstone was clear. No footprints or signs of a struggle. It was unsettling how the woman had disappeared without leaving a mark. The place was peaceful, almost too peaceful, as if someone had intentionally erased any evidence of her presence. "Was there anyone unusual around this morning?" Miss Marple asked, her voice calm but probing. The miller shook his head. "No, it was a quiet morning, same as any other." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the small bench near the door. A piece of cloth, faintly stained with something dark, lay crumpled on the floor. It was small, almost unnoticeable, but her trained eye caught it immediately. She bent down to examine it closer. "This is hers," the miller said, his voice tight as he watched her inspect it. "That's my wife's shawl. I don't know how it got there." Miss Marple held the fabric up to the light, noticing the distinct pattern, simple yet familiar. Her mind raced. The cloth was similar to the piece she had found in the churchyard, the scrap of fabric she had collected from Sylvia's likely hiding spot. She had suspected a connection before, but now, with this new clue, it was more than a hunch. There was a link between Sylvia and the miller's wife. But how? "Have you spoken with anyone outside the village?" Miss Marple asked, looking up from the cloth. The miller shook his head again. "No, we keep to ourselves mostly, but she was different lately. I've noticed her being anxious, always looking over her shoulder, like she was expecting someone to come for her." Miss Marple's mind clicked into place. This woman, too, had been trying to escape something, just as Sylvia had. Was it possible that these two disappearances were connected? Or were they just the beginning of something far darker, unfolding within the village? "Thank you," Miss Marple said, standing up and brushing the dust off her hands. "I'll look into this, and I'll keep my ears open for any other details that might help us understand what's truly going on." As Miss Marple left the mill, her thoughts swirled with the new information. Two women, two disappearances, two lives tied together by threads of mystery. But what was the common link? It wasn't just coincidence. There had to be something deeper, something tied to the past that no one had yet discovered. Later that evening, Miss Marple sat in her parlour, reflecting on the events of the day. The village, so calm on the surface, was hiding something sinister. She had always known that, but now the layers were peeling away. Sylvia's disappearance had not been an isolated incident. It had been a part of something far larger. A force, or perhaps a person, who had begun to manipulate the quiet life of Little Cranford. She turned her attention to the fabric in her hands, the scrap she had found in the churchyard earlier. She knew now that it wasn't just a symbol of escape. It was evidence. Evidence that connected the two missing women. And the more she thought about it, the more certain she became. There was only one way forward, into the heart of the village's hidden truths. Miss Marple knew one thing for certain. The murderer, or the person pulling the strings, was closer than anyone realized, and she would find them, one thread at a time. Chapter 8. The snow had begun to fall again, lightly at first, covering the streets of Little Cranford in a blanket of white. The chill in the air seemed to mirror the growing tension in the village. Miss Marple had spent the previous evening piecing together her findings, each clue a thread leading her closer to the truth. Sylvia's disappearance, the miller's wife's sudden vanishing, and the strange fabric she had found, everything pointed toward a single, undeniable conclusion. Someone in the village was hiding the truth. But Miss Marple knew that the most dangerous thing was rushing to conclusions. Each person, each seemingly innocent conversation, was a piece of the puzzle, but she needed more. She needed the person behind it all to reveal themselves, willingly or not. That morning, as she sat in her armchair with a steaming cup of tea, Miss Marple made a decision. It was time to set a trap. If her instincts were right, and if she could create the right circumstances, the true culprit would expose themselves. She would have to be patient, subtle, and, above all, calm. This would require a delicate balance. She had learned a great deal in the past days. The miller's wife had been hiding something, and Sylvia's background was more tangled than anyone had realized. But the connection was still unclear. Miss Marple had to find a way to force the final link to emerge, to make the hidden truths surface. And she had just the plan in mind. Later that day, Miss Marple made her way to Mr. Clarendon's house. The village had already whispered much about him. His sudden departure after Sylvia's disappearance, his aloof demeanour, and his suspicious behaviour. Miss Marple had kept her distance, not wanting to rush to judgment, but now she felt it was time to confront him. As she knocked on the door, a faint unease crept into her chest. Mr. Clarendon was no fool, and she knew he would have been watching her too. But this time, Miss Marple was prepared. The door opened, and Mr. Clarendon appeared in his usual sharp attire, his face a study in polite indifference. "Miss Marple, what a pleasant surprise," he said, his tone smooth but with an undercurrent of caution. "To what do I owe the honour?" "I've come to ask you a few questions, Mr. Clarendon," Miss Marple said, her voice calm, but her eyes sharp. "About Sylvia Morrow and your recent trip to London." Mr. Clarendon's eyes flickered slightly, though his expression remained unchanged. "I'm afraid I don't have much to tell you, Miss Marple. I told Constable Hayes everything. I left for business matters, and I had no knowledge of Miss Morrow's disappearance." Miss Marple studied him for a long moment, noting the subtle shift in his stance. "You know, Mr. Clarendon, it's strange. I've spoken with a few of the villagers, and some of them have noticed your peculiar behaviour. A few have mentioned that Sylvia spoke of you rather warily." Clarendon's expression hardened for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "I can't speak for what Sylvia might have said, but I've done nothing wrong. I've been in London, and as you know, I returned only recently." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Yes, your timing is rather curious. Just after Sylvia vanished. And of course, there's the matter of the miller's wife. You wouldn't happen to know anything about her disappearance, would you?" Clarendon's gaze turned steely. "I have no idea what you're implying, Miss Marple. I've had no dealings with that woman, nor do I have any interest in Miss Morrow's affairs." Miss Marple smiled gently. "You're not the only one with secrets, Mr. Clarendon, but I do think you might know something you're not telling me. You see, I've learned something very interesting. I found a small scrap of cloth, quite similar to the one I found at the miller's house. It's an unusual pattern, and it seems that it connects two people who disappeared under strange circumstances. I wonder, do you think these disappearances are connected in some way?" Clarendon's eyes narrowed, and for a fleeting second his composure cracked. He stepped back, as if considering his next words carefully. Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. She had him now. It was subtle, but it was enough to know that he was hiding something. "I think you should leave, Miss Marple," he said quietly, his voice suddenly cold. "You're making a mistake. I have nothing more to say to you." Miss Marple didn't flinch. "Of course, Mr. Clarendon, but I do hope we can speak again soon. There are too many unanswered questions after all." As Miss Marple turned to leave, she noticed a glint of something in Clarendon's eyes, something that hinted at a deeper fear. She knew then that she was close. He was hiding something important, something that would lead her to the truth. Miss Marple's plan was working. The trap was set. The next day, Miss Marple continued her quiet observations, but she had already put in motion the final part of her plan. She arranged for a casual meeting at Mrs. Melrose's house, where the villagers would gather for tea once again. This time, however, she wasn't interested in the usual gossip. She needed the key players to be in the same room, where she could observe their reactions more closely. As the guests arrived, Miss Marple made a point of positioning herself strategically near the door. She could already see Dr. Davies, Mrs. Laverne, and even Mr. Clarendon all present. Each person had their own secrets, but Miss Marple knew she would find the answer today. Something, one slip of the tongue, one nervous gesture, would reveal all. It was then that Miss Marple decided to push forward. She casually brought up Sylvia's disappearance again, allowing the conversation to turn in the direction she wanted. And as expected, the reactions were subtle. Small shifts, unspoken tension that only Miss Marple could interpret. A nervous cough here, a fleeting glance there. It was all falling into place. The final reveal was near, and Miss Marple knew it would be the perfect moment when her trap was triggered. She just needed to wait for the right reaction. Chapter 9. The clock in Mrs. Melrose's drawing room ticked steadily, its sound filling the otherwise hushed room. The atmosphere was thick with unease. As the group gathered for tea, the same faces as always, yet today there was a distinct tension that hovered in the air. Miss Marple, sitting quietly in the corner with her cup, allowed the conversation to swirl around her. The small talk, the polite chatter, the forced laughter, it was all part of the dance, and Miss Marple had learned long ago to remain still and observe while others revealed what they truly felt. Mr. Clarendon sat across the room, his demeanour polished but cold, a subtle tension in his posture that hadn't been there before. Dr. Davies, usually calm and collected, was now fidgeting with his glasses, his gaze flickering nervously toward the door, as though anticipating something he couldn't control. Mrs. Laverne, for all her usual bluntness, had been oddly quiet, her gaze occasionally darting toward Miss Marple as if wondering what the older woman was up to. It was all too perfect. Miss Marple had carefully arranged the seating, ensuring that each of the players in the village's drama would be close enough to observe, yet distant enough to avoid direct confrontation. She needed them relaxed, off guard, and she had been patient enough to know that the right moment would come. It always did. The trap was now set, and it was time to spring it. Miss Marple gently placed her cup down, the soft clink of porcelain barely audible in the room. She caught Mrs. Melrose's eye and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was a signal. Without waiting for any more polite pleasantries, she spoke, her voice calm and deliberate. "I've been thinking about Sylvia Morrow's disappearance," she said, glancing around the room. "And the miller's wife. Both vanished without a trace. Odd, isn't it? So much talk in the village, but no real answers. The more I think about it, the more I wonder if there's a connection between these two disappearances." The room fell into an uneasy silence. Mrs. Laverne cleared her throat, but it was clear she was on edge. Dr. Davies adjusted his glasses again, his fingers trembling slightly as he did so. Miss Marple watched all of this carefully, her eyes flicking between them. She wasn't asking for answers yet. She was simply setting the stage. "And then there's Mr. Clarendon," she continued, her voice gentle but firm. "I must admit, I'm curious about your timing, Mr. Clarendon. Leaving town just after Sylvia vanished. You had a business trip, you say. A coincidence, perhaps?" Mr. Clarendon stiffened slightly at the mention of his name, but he maintained his composure. "I've already explained myself, Miss Marple. I was in London for business. There's nothing more to say." Miss Marple tilted her head, her gaze steady. "Of course, but I've spoken to a few people, and there's something unsettling about your absence. You see, I've been doing some thinking, and I've realized something rather peculiar. I found a piece of cloth, similar to one I've seen before, The fabric was found near the churchyard, the site where Sylvia often walked. A slight gasp escaped Mrs. Laverne's lips, and Miss Marple's eyes immediately caught the nervous flicker of Dr. Davies's expression. He was no longer looking directly at her, but instead was staring into his cup, his fingers gripping the porcelain a little too tightly. "How very interesting," Miss Marple continued, her voice taking on a thoughtful tone. "The same fabric, the same pattern. I wonder if it was just an accident that it appeared near the churchyard, or if it's a sign that these two disappearances are tied together somehow. And of course, that would explain the odd behaviour of both Sylvia and the miller's wife, wouldn't it? Both were hiding something, running from something. And it seems to me, gentlemen and ladies, that whatever they were running from might have been closer to home than they realised." There was a long pause, and for a moment the room seemed to hold its breath. Mr. Clarendon's face remained unchanged, but his jaw tightened and his eyes narrowed slightly. Dr. Davies was still avoiding eye contact, and Mrs. Laverne's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her tea. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice low but sharp. "But what I find most curious of all," she continued, "is the fact that not one of you has offered any explanation for what connects these disappearances. Why hasn't anyone spoken of the one thing that might tie it all together?" The silence stretched, but Miss Marple's question hung in the air like a challenge. She could feel the subtle shift in the room as the tension became palpable. Every single person in the room was on edge, their every move betraying their discomfort. "Isn't it strange," Miss Marple said, her tone almost casual, "that no one seems to want to talk about Sylvia's father? A man who was known to have been involved in some rather questionable activities. Yet no one here seems to want to mention him. Odd, don't you think?" At this, Dr. Davies's eyes flicked up, his gaze momentarily meeting Miss Marple's. The smallest crack in his carefully maintained facade. It was enough. Miss Marple had struck the right nerve. "Perhaps," Miss Marple said slowly, "the connection lies not in what we know about these two women, but in what they were trying to escape. And perhaps one of you here knows more than you've let on." Mr. Clarendon's composure faltered for just a fraction of a second, and Miss Marple knew that her words had landed. The trap had been set, and the first signs of the guilty party's unease were starting to surface. She leaned back in her chair, watching them closely. "But I'm not here to accuse anyone, of course. I'll let you all explain yourselves in your own time. After all, we've all had secrets to keep, haven't we?" Chapter 10. The room was thick with tension. The faces of the villagers were a study in discomfort, each person caught in the web Miss Marple had spun with such quiet precision. The game had shifted, and though no one had openly admitted anything, the subtle changes in their behaviour told a story all on its own. Miss Marple's calm demeanour only heightened the tension. She remained silent, letting the words she had spoken echo in the minds of the group. It was clear to her that the walls were starting to close in. The air was heavy with unspoken thoughts as Mr. Clarendon, Dr. Davies, and Mrs. Laverne sat frozen, their eyes shifting away from Miss Marple's steady gaze. The silence stretched, a taut thread threatening to snap at any moment. Miss Marple watched each of them carefully, noting the way they avoided meeting each other's eyes, the way their bodies seemed to shrink slightly under her scrutiny. They were hiding something, and she was close to uncovering it. Mr. Clarendon, despite his earlier bravado, was the first to break the silence. His voice, usually so composed, now held an edge of irritation. I don't know what you think you're implying, Miss Marple, he said, his words sharp, but this is absurd. I've told you everything I know. Sylvia was a troubled girl. Yes, perhaps a bit secretive, but that's hardly reason to jump to such wild conclusions. Miss Marple didn't respond immediately. Instead, she allowed the tension to simmer, knowing that it was his own unease that would reveal more than his words ever could. Of course, she said finally, her voice soft. You've been quite forthcoming. It's just odd, isn't it? How you've been so quick to brush aside any connection between yourself and Sylvia. You see, I've spoken with several people in the village, people who've been more honest about their interactions with her. And then there's the matter of the fabric I found, the one with the same pattern as the one Sylvia wore. Mr. Clarendon stiffened visibly at the mention of the fabric, his eyes narrowing. You're making a mountain out of a molehill, Miss Marple. There's no connection between me and Sylvia's disappearance. I didn't even know her all that well. Funny, Miss Marple mused aloud, because the way you've reacted, well, it suggests otherwise. Almost as if you know something more. Something you're not telling me. Clarendon's jaw clenched, and for a moment Miss Marple saw the mask slip. The cold, calculated exterior faltered, and in that brief moment Miss Marple saw a flash of guilt. She leaned in ever so slightly, her voice quieter now. You see, Mr. Clarendon, when people are hiding something, they often overcompensate. They try too hard to appear indifferent, to avoid attention, but that only draws it closer. I wonder if you're starting to realize that. Dr. Davies, who had been uncharacteristically silent, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Miss Marple's gaze flicked to him, her expression unreadable. Dr. Davies, you've been unusually quiet. What do you think about all of this? You've known Mr. Clarendon for a long time, haven't you? The doctor looked up, startled, his face paling slightly as he fumbled with his glasses. Well, I don't think there's anything more to discuss. I've already told you what I know. Miss Marple's lips twitched upward ever so slightly, but it wasn't a smile, just a knowing expression that seemed to unravel Dr. Davies's calm. But you've said so much, Dr. Davies, about Sylvia's father, about how he was involved in questionable activities, and how Sylvia, poor girl, was running from something. But you never did tell me why you know so much about Sylvia's family. Why is that? Dr. Davies froze, the colour draining from his face as he struggled to answer. I was just trying to help, he stammered, clearly flustered. I didn't mean to cause any trouble. Miss Marple's eyes never left him. Help? Is that what you were doing, Doctor? Or were you hiding something? Perhaps something more personal? The room went still. Mrs. Laverne, who had been watching Miss Marple with a mixture of admiration and apprehension, suddenly spoke up, her voice laced with frustration. You can't possibly expect us to believe all these accusations, Miss Marple. We've all had our secrets, haven't we? We all have things we'd rather keep hidden, but it doesn't mean we're guilty of anything. Miss Marple turned her gaze to Mrs. Laverne, her voice soft but resolute. I'm not accusing anyone, Mrs. Laverne. I'm simply trying to understand the truth. The truth is always simpler than people think, hidden in plain sight. And the more we try to bury it, the harder it becomes to keep concealed. There was a long pause before Mrs. Laverne finally spoke again, her tone more subdued now. What are you suggesting, Miss Marple? That one of us is responsible for Sylvia's disappearance? Miss Marple didn't immediately answer. Instead, she slowly stood up, her movements graceful but deliberate. What I'm suggesting, Mrs. Laverne, is that you all have been caught up in something much bigger than you realize. Something that has nothing to do with Sylvia's disappearance at all. The words hung in the air, thick with meaning. Miss Marple had seen it. The cracks in the facade, the guilt that laced each word, each glance. And now she had a decision to make. She could push them further, but that might send them scattering like rats, or she could wait for them to make the first move. But Miss Marple was patient. She would wait. Perhaps, she continued after a beat, you'll see what I mean when I tell you this. The one person who could have stopped all of this from happening is the one who's been hiding in plain sight all along. Her eyes swept over the group, watching them carefully. She had said enough. Now the pieces were finally starting to fit. Chapter 11. The tension in the room was palpable as Miss Marple's words hung in the air. She had made her statement, and now the silence between them stretched out, each person grappling with the weight of her insinuation. The group had grown quieter, each person lost in their thoughts, avoiding direct eye contact. It was clear that something significant had been triggered in their minds, but no one dared speak it aloud yet. Miss Marple's gaze swept over them, her sharp eyes never missing a flicker of emotion. She had played her part carefully, guiding them to this point. They were all on edge, and the subtle shifts in their posture told her everything she needed to know. Her quiet observation had paid off. Now she waited, letting the moment stretch to its natural breaking point. Mr. Clarendon was the first to speak, his voice strained. "What are you suggesting, Miss Marple? That we're all somehow involved in Sylvia's disappearance? This is absurd." Miss Marple didn't flinch. She merely watched him closely, noting the way his voice cracked just slightly, betraying the calm he tried so hard to project. He was guilty, there was no doubt about it now. The only question left was the why. "I'm not suggesting anything, Mr. Clarendon," she said calmly. "I'm simply stating facts. Sylvia Morrow didn't just disappear on her own, and neither did the miller's wife. Both of them were hiding something. But the question is, who was the one making sure their secrets stayed buried?" There was a pause as the room seemed to hold its breath. Dr. Davies shifted in his seat, his hands gripping the edge of his chair as if trying to steady himself. Mrs. Laverne opened her mouth as though to speak but stopped short, her lips trembling. "Tell us what you know, Miss Marple," Mrs. Laverne said, her voice shaking slightly. "You've got us all on edge. We need to know what this is all about." Miss Marple gave a slight smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. She had been waiting for this moment. It was time to pull the threads together, to reveal the truth that had been hiding in plain sight all along. "Do you remember what I said at the tea party?" she began, her voice soft, drawing them in. "The fabric, the pattern. It was the same in both cases. The cloth I found near the churchyard was just the first clue. But what really tied these two disappearances together was something more obvious, something none of you considered. And it wasn't the fabric that connected them, but the person who was pulling the strings behind the scenes." She paused again, watching as they absorbed her words. They were hanging on every sentence now, each person waiting for her to finish. "You see," Miss Marple continued, her voice now sharp with the clarity of her deductions, "the one person who knew about both Sylvia and the miller's wife, the one person who could have manipulated them both into leaving, was someone who had a vested interest in keeping their secrets safe. It was someone who could easily keep people from asking questions. Someone who could control the flow of information, the movement of people, and the perception of the village. Miss Marple looked directly at Dr. Davies. For a moment, the room seemed to freeze. Dr. Davies stiffened, his hand gripping the armrest of his chair, his face paling. "You," Miss Marple said, her voice unwavering. "You, Dr. Davies, were the one who pushed both Sylvia and the miller's wife into hiding. It was you who kept their secrets buried. It was you who knew how to make them disappear without anyone suspecting anything." Dr. Davies opened his mouth, but no words came out. His face was a mask of shock, his eyes wide with the realization that Miss Marple had uncovered everything. He had underestimated her, thought he could remain hidden behind his calm demeanor and professional facade. "You see," Miss Marple continued, "Sylvia Morrow wasn't running from just any danger. She was running from her father's past, from debts and shady dealings, from a world she couldn't escape. And the miller's wife, who had once been Sylvia's confidant, knew more about it than anyone realized. When Sylvia came to Little Cranford, she was already being hunted by her father's associates. But there was someone in the village who could protect her, or so she thought." Miss Marple turned towards Mrs. Laverne. "Mrs. Laverne knew something too, didn't you? You were the one who warned Sylvia, but it was too late. You knew Dr. Davies had a hand in this, and you feared the worst, but you didn't act fast enough. You stayed silent, and now Sylvia is gone, just like the miller's wife." Dr. Davies finally found his voice, but it was weak, filled with desperation. "I didn't want this. I never wanted this, Sylvia. She didn't deserve it. She was going to ruin everything, ruin my reputation. She was going to tell people what I had done." Miss Marple's eyes softened ever so slightly, but she didn't relent. "You were desperate, Dr. Davies. You feared what she might expose, so you pushed her to leave. And when she refused to cooperate, you took more drastic measures." The room was silent now, the truth hanging heavy in the air. Miss Marple had done it. She had uncovered the secret that had been lurking in the heart of the village. Dr. Davies was the mastermind behind it all, using his position as the village's trusted doctor to manipulate the people around him, to silence them, and to keep his darkest secrets hidden. But now, with the truth revealed, there was no escaping the consequences. Chapter 12. The room felt smaller now, with the weight of truth settling heavily over them all. Miss Marple's words had pierced through the web of lies Dr. Davies had woven so carefully, and now there was no turning back. The silence was suffocating, thick with guilt and fear as Dr. Davies sat frozen, unable to speak, his hands trembling at his sides. Miss Marple stood, her posture unchanged, her eyes focused on him with a mixture of quiet sorrow and determination. She had seen many like him, people who, when caught in their own lies, were too afraid to confront the truth. He had tried to protect his reputation, his secrets, but in the end, it was his fear that had driven him to commit the very acts he had hoped to hide. "You didn't just hurt Sylvia, did you?" Miss Marple's voice was gentle, but the words cut deep. "You destroyed her. You made sure she was silenced. And when the miller's wife got too close to the truth, you made sure she disappeared too." Dr. Davies remained silent, his face pale as his eyes darted to the others in the room. His colleagues, the people he had worked with for years. He had been so careful, so meticulous in his manipulations. But now, all the pieces had fallen into place, and the web he had spun was unraveling faster than he could control. "I never meant for it to go this far," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I didn't want anyone to get hurt, but I couldn't let her ruin everything I'd worked for. My practice, my life, it would have all been destroyed." Miss Marple's gaze softened for a moment. "And yet, Dr. Davies, it is your own actions that have led to this destruction. Sylvia wasn't the first. and she won't be the last. There are always consequences when people choose to hide the truth for too long. The others in the room, Mrs. Laverne, Mr. Clarendon, and even Dr. Davies's longtime colleagues, were all watching now, their faces a mix of disbelief and fear. None of them had seen the depth of his deception until now. It was clear that none of them had expected the quiet, composed man they had trusted to be capable of such calculated cruelty. "You see," Miss Marple continued, her voice firm, "Sylvia's disappearance was not the first tragedy you caused, Dr. Davies. It was the culmination of a series of actions, each one pushing her further and further into fear, until she had nowhere to turn but to run. And when she refused to obey you, when she refused to be silenced, you took matters into your own hands." There was a long pause as Dr. Davies finally raised his eyes to meet hers. There was no denying it now. The truth had been laid bare before him, and all his defences had crumbled. His life, built on years of deception, was about to unravel in front of him. "I didn't mean to kill her," Dr. Davies said, his voice barely a whisper. "I only wanted to keep her quiet, but I didn't know what else to do. She was going to expose everything." Miss Marple sighed softly, shaking her head. "It was never about keeping her quiet, was it, Dr. Davies? It was about control. You didn't just want to hide your secrets. You wanted to break her, make her disappear, so no one would ever know the truth." At that moment, Constable Hayes stepped into the room, his face grim. He had been listening from the doorway, having arrived just in time to hear Miss Marple's final revelations. He had known something was amiss, but now the truth was clearer than ever. "You're under arrest, Dr. Davies," the constable said, his voice heavy with authority, "for the disappearances of Sylvia Morrow and the miller's wife, and for the murder of Sylvia Morrow." Dr. Davies didn't resist. There was nothing left for him to say, no defence he could offer. He stood slowly, his shoulders slumped with the weight of his guilt. As the constable moved to place the handcuffs on him, Dr. Davies looked at Miss Marple one last time. "I never meant for it to end this way," he said quietly, his voice hollow. "But I couldn't stop it. I couldn't stop her." Miss Marple watched him as he was led away, her expression sombre but resolute. She had uncovered the truth, pieced together the scattered fragments of a web of lies and fear. And now justice would be served, though it came at a high cost. The next few weeks saw Little Cranford slowly returning to normal, though the air was still thick with the memory of the tragedy. Sylvia Morrow's body was found in a secluded part of the woods, not far from where Miss Marple had discovered the scrap of cloth. Her father's influence, and the fear he had instilled in her, had been the cause of her flight. But in the end, it was Dr. Davies who had sealed her fate, choosing to eliminate her rather than face the consequences of his own actions. The miller's wife was found alive, though she had been hidden away in a remote cabin, terrified into silence by the doctor's threats. She had been too afraid to come forward, but after the truth was revealed, she was able to share her story, confirming Miss Marple's suspicions. As the village returned to its peaceful rhythm, there was an air of unease that lingered in the streets. The people of Little Cranford had been forced to confront the darkness that lay beneath their idyllic lives. And though justice had been served, the scars remained. Miss Marple sat quietly in her favourite chair, her thoughts distant as she gazed out the window. She had solved the case, but there was always another one waiting, another puzzle to unravel. As long as people were capable of hiding the truth, Miss Marple knew there would always be secrets to uncover. And she would be ready, as always, to bring them into the light.